that? What the fuck is that?
An ancient community of Roman Jews.
Okay, there are several groups of Jews in Italy. Not as many as in India, but still, many. There are Sephardi Jews, a term colloquially used to refer to most Mediterranean Jews, but I guess more pedantically is just for Iberian Jews. There are Ashkenazi Jews in the north of Italy, where Italians are extra German. For example, their former Prime Minister Mario Draghi has been called more German than Germans, which is perhaps why he is succeeded by Meloni. And there are a bunch of French Jews who were expelled in 1182 as the Crusades kicked off, with widespread European massacres of Jews, as all the Crusades did. There are the Apulian Jews, who live in the boot of Italy and speak Greek. There are also a bunch of decent communities of Persian and Libyan Jews in Rome, Milan, Livorno, and a bunch of crypto Jews scattered throughout as the result of Europe doing European things. Finally, there's the group we're going to focus on today, the Italkim. The Italkim, or the Jews of the Italian Rite, are thought to have come to the region sometime after the destruction of the First Temple, although the earliest physical evidence is in the form of tombstones and dedicatory inscriptions from 2nd century BCE things. These are mostly Greek-speaking Hellenized Jews in the south of Italy, but a few were in Rome. Also, interestingly, in the year 139 BCE, a law was passed expelling Jews who were not Roman citizens from Rome, implying that there were Jews in Rome and that there were Jewish Roman citizens. Wow! After the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 AD, many more Jews were brought to Rome as slaves. We've covered the diaspora many times, so suffice to say, it was whack. It was horrible. I'm not going to get into it. I do, however, want to point out the Arch of Titus. Titus was an emperor of Rome, but before that, he's the general who besieged Jerusalem, destroyed the Second Temple, and scattered and enslaved the locals. This archway was built in Rome to celebrate his brutal crushing of the Jewish revolt, and clearly shows the menorah being carried off as spoils of war from the temple. The sack of Jerusalem resulted in approximately 1 million deaths, and 100,000 Jews enslaved, according to Flavius Josephus, who is a Jewish Roman soldier and historian. If you're Jewish in Rome, you're not supposed to go under this arch, I hear. Very interestingly, Titus apparently had a long-term relationship with the Jewish client queen of Judea, Queen Bernice of Cilicia. Apparently, they struck up a relationship when Titus came to put down the revolt somewhere between 67 and 69 AD, and continued their relationship until he was forced to cast her aside upon his ascension to emperor in 79 due to Roman mistrust of Jews. Now, this little bit of information we have kind of makes it look like she was a race traitor and Rome lover, in that the accounts suggest they really did appreciate each other and he took her to Rome and gave her a lot of political power. However, I must say, when mans pull up with their guys, real savage Donnie's ready to nank you for no reason. A level of coercion is implied. Anyway, I've always thought about how strange it must have been for these Jews living in Rome, while Rome repeatedly massacred your people back in the motherland. It must have been like the equivalent of Venezuelans or Afghans living in the US, or Israeli Palestinians. Much of what we have from the late 2nd century CE comes from Josephus, the historian I mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, Josephus was also kind of a race traitor. I mean, he might not have had a choice. His account often fudges the facts to make it seem like the Roman Empire was kind of okay to Jews. For example, he takes instances of rights given to individual Jews and tries to pass them off as applying to the whole Jewish community, while at the same time ignoring negative imperial decrees. He might actually be an interesting guy to make a video about, but some other time. Between 66 CE and 135 CE, most of the Jewish population of the province of Judea was ethnically cleansed, that is, killed, sold into slavery, or forced to flee. The Romans also renamed Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina and Judea province to Syria Palestina to erase their historical ties. Special taxes were levied on remaining Jews, and a law was actually passed in 135 that banned Jews from setting foot in Jerusalem. Just as Jews were diasporaed throughout the Babylonian Empire, Jews were also diasporaed throughout the Roman Empire, mainly to other parts of the Middle East and North Africa, but many settled in southern and eastern Europe, including what is now Italy. It was tough for these guys. Roman pagans who proudly killed Jesus as part of their destruction of Judaism converted to Christianity under Constantine in the 300s, and suddenly, bang, they're killing Jews for killing Jesus. Make up your minds. Mixed marriages were also prohibited by Constantine at this time, as well as laws to exclude Jews from the economy and punishing conversion to Judaism with death. Emperor Julian, who took over in 361, rejected Christianity and actually let the Jews return to Jerusalem, but that didn't last long. He was killed in battle in 363. Salute. After him, all the emperors went back to Christianity. We talked about the Jews of the Byzantine Empire a little bit in the Greece video, so I'm not going to recover it. After the split, the Western Roman Empire dwindled, existed as a puppet state, and in 476, Germanic king Odoacer, deposed the last Western Roman emperor. Once Ostrogothic rule was established under King Theodoric in 493, there were thriving Jewish communities in Rome, Milan, Genoa, Palermo, Messina, Agrigentum, and Sardinia. Things were good, to the point where many Jews fought for the Goths against the Byzantine reconquest attempted under Justinian. Because of this, in the area Justinian did manage to capture, the Exarchate of Ravenna, Jews were massacred and had their property seized. But things got better when the Lombards, another Germanic people, conquered most of Italy between 568 and 774. The Lombards didn't give a single f*** about the Jews, which, all things considered, is usually a good thing. The Wikipedia page has a great quote. Quote, "The fact that the historians of this period scarcely make mention of the Jews suggests that their circumstances were tolerable. Real. What we do have is things like anti-Jewish pogroms in Palermo in 598, being condemned by the church, though. So, don't think it was sweet." The Lombards eventually converted to Catholicism, and the papacy exerted their power on them. There were canonical laws against the Jews owning property and exorbitant taxes, but enforcement allegedly varied from pope to pope. "Mom, it's 1096 and all the aristocrats are crusading to kill infidels in the Holy Land." "Don't worry, my precious Christian baby boy. We have infidels at home." Yeah. Dead meme, whatever. I'm going to gloss over this, but as the people of means were traveling to the Holy Land, the peasantry and lords who stayed behind wanted to get in on the fun, which they did by massacring thousands and thousands of Jews. Okay, so you should know, Middle Ages Italy is a complete mess of city-states and kingdoms and foreign invaders, each with their own laws and feelings about Jews. Because of this, I'm going to abridge a lot of stuff. Jews were briefly expelled from Bologna in 1172. In Trani, the 4 synagogues in the city were transformed into churches and their congregations were forced to convert. Pope Innocent III, 1198 to 1216, threatened excommunication for any Italian governor who placed Jews in public positions, accused them of ritual murder, and ordered that every Jew must always wear a conspicuously displayed yellow badge. Maybe the Nazis weren't such an aberration after all. Things weren't bad all over, though. Southern Italy and Sicily were under Norman rule at the time. Very interesting. And the Normans did not care. Sicily was actually the best place to be Jewish for quite some time, and Jews made up 5% of the population, until 1492, when the island came under influence of the Spanish and they had to flee. But that's way ahead of where we are. Anyway, back to good things around this time. The Bishop of Mantua, in the name of the Pope, gave permission to Jews to lend money at interest. Remember that most of Europe's Jews were barred from accumulating wealth by any traditional means, i.e. land ownership. So the Pope allowing Jews to be bankers became one of the only avenues for Jewish success. In a wonderful example of Jewish excellence, they took full advantage of this, allowing for the formation of a strong, usurious population in cities like Venice, Florence, Genoa, and Pisa. But then the Black Death hit in 1347. Who's to blame? I don't know. The Jews, probably? Tens of thousands, maybe more, Jews were murdered, including a German incident where 2,000 Jews were burned alive on Valentine's Day, 1349. Maybe the Nazis weren't such an aberration after all. Did it help? No, but no one cared. The massacres weren't as bad in most of Italy, and as Jews were expelled from Europe, England 1290, France 1334, Spain 1492, and Portugal, many settled in Italy, which is when the Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews showed up. Some Italian city-states weren't happy about that, and Naples expelled their Jews in 1533, and Genoa a few years later. And there was an attempted expulsion from Rome, but it didn't go anywhere. Because Italians can't organize for shit. These new Jews settled in as best they could, but the communities remained distinct from the Italkim. In 1555, Pope Paul IV denied Jews from having any profession at all and forced them all to move into the newly created Roman ghetto, where they were required to wear the yellow badges. Fun fact, ghetto is actually an Italian word meaning place where you stick your Jews. It caught on in most of the rest of Italy, except in Pesaro, where the Duke of Urbino welcomed them in the hopes of establishing stronger trade relations with the Ottomans, who were famously so much better to Jews. Things were good in Venice, where after fervent debate, they ultimately decided they would negotiate with the Turkish Jewish ambassador sent to them in 1574. They even let his son study at the University of Padua. Wow! While that doesn't sound like much, because it literally isn't, and Jews still had to live in the Venetian ghetto, Venice often clashed with the papacy and didn't like them meddling in their affairs, resulting in a toleration of Jews having jobs, especially for trade with Turkey and banking. Then in 1600, Shakespeare drops The Merchant of Venice and has the racist caricature Shylock, the greedy Jew, and that sucks, but shows that there are Jews in Venice. Also, Shakespeare probably didn't know any Jews because they were still banned from being in England at the time. After Pope Paul IV and Pius V forced Jews into ghettos that were routinely raided and torched, and disallowed Jews from having any profession at all, most of the Jews of Italy left at this point. There wasn't much reason to stay, especially since you could hop right across the Adriatic to Ottoman Greece at this point and, be a human. Pope Sixtus V took over in 1585 and allowed Jews to be physicians for some reason. Just physicians. He also allowed Jews to reprint the Torah and Talmud, as most had been burned under the previous popes. Unfortunately, he was succeeded by Clement VIII in 1592 who renewed the anti-Jewish laws, except for Turkish Jews, because he didn't want to piss off the Ottomans. I love you, Ottomans. So a bunch of Jews settled in the Duchy of Milan until they were exiled from there in 1597. The 30 Years' War broke out, Jews were massacred, the Ottomans rolled through Europe and up to Vienna, so Italian Christians massacred Jews who they suspected of favorably viewing the only European power that let Jews be people. Skipping ahead, Napoleon was great for Jews. I'll talk about that some other time. All the canonical laws against Jews were no longer enforced, but it ended when Napoleon fell out of power. So, really got to power through. The unification of Italy was kicked off by the revolutions of 1848, shoutouts Garibaldi. Papal persecution ended except in Rome until it too was captured and unified in 1871. When the Risorgimento troops captured Rome, they were treated as liberators when they opened the ghetto, letting the impoverished and starving people out. Oof. As we enter the 20th century, I would like to remind everyone that Italy was actually one of the best places in Christian Europe to be Jewish. Madness. It's a miracle anyone even survived to get Holocausted. And it's a tragedy that the Ottomans got stopped at Vienna. Post-unification Italy was great for a little bit. Prime Minister Luigi Luzzati, one of the world's very first Jewish heads of state, took office in 1910. And between 1907 and 1913, the mayor of Rome, Ernesto Nathan, was also a Jew. Even the Catholic Church decided to publicly put their best foot forward, as Vatican archives declassified by Pope John Paul II show. Rather than blanket anti-Semitism, bishops and publications were encouraged to use a strategy that distinguished between good and bad anti-Semitism. Bad anti-Semitism was hatred of the Jews due to their being Jewish, and the church condemned this in public. They instead promoted good anti-Semitism, which was alleging that Jews were plotting to take over the world through newspapers and schools, and they openly created and spread this information. When criticized for it, they would show everyone how they had condemned the bad anti-Semitism. Rinse, repeat. It's almost as if this whole anti-Semitism playbook is tired as fuck. Regardless, Jews were finally beginning to enter society. During World War I, approximately 5,000 Jews served in the Royal Italian Army, of whom about 420 were killed and 700 received military decorations. In fact, Jews may have integrated too much for their own good, as an estimated 230 Italian Jews marched on Rome to put Mussolini in power in 1922, and a 1938 census listed 590 Jewish quote-unquote old fighters who had joined the National Fascist Party before 1922. There were also many Jews in the anti-fascist organizations that sprang up to combat it, but it's interesting to think about Jewish fascists nonetheless. But what you need to know about fascism is Mussolini did it first, and Mussolini did it different. When Hitler was just a no-name Austrian bum, Mussolini was out here swinging his dick around. From 1922 to 1938, many Jews were actually close friends and advisors of Mussolini, including Margherita Sarfatti, who was a political advisor and probably lover of Mussolini. Wow, Bernice Part 2. Mussolini wasn't like that until he had to be. His brand of civic ultranationalism didn't have all the eugenic weirdness of the Nazis, at least not yet. He had Jewish friends, he had the Jewish lover, and he even supported Jewish groups in Palestine, hoping to gain some Italian influence in the Middle East. Mussolini wanted an empire, and after the embarrassing Italian defeat in the First Italo-Ethiopian War between 1887 and 1889, he had his sights set there. They used bombs and chemical weapons and violated the Geneva Conventions using aerial assaults on civilians. The campaign was brutal, and though the Ethiopians put up a good fight, Italy finally conquered them. Despite holding the territory until 1943, and ignoring the fact that they deposed Haile Selassie, said to be a direct descendant of King Solomon, the colonial regime wasn't uniquely awful to the Beta Israel Jews living there, despite openly acknowledging them. In fact, there was a lot of interest in Ethiopian Jews. Fun-ish fact, the first European scholar to write a scientific paper about Beta Israel in 1843 was an Italiki Jew named Filoseno Luzzatto, but that's neither here nor there. Despite Mussolini's personal feelings about Jews, he was still a slimeball. As eugenic race-based fascism became the norm in the rest of Europe during the 30s, many Italian fascists adopted it as well. Seeing which way the winds were blowing, the Italian racial laws were passed in 1938. Mixed marriages were banned, books by Jewish authors were burned, assets were seized, Jews were banned from public offices and higher education, travel was restricted, no civil rights, etc. Just like the good old days before unification. But unlike pre-unification, there was no less harsh Italian city-state that Jews could run to. Interestingly, it didn't get Germany or Vichy France bad. Not immediately, at least. Even after the outbreak of World War II and the opening of concentration camps, Italian Jews were not interred. About 2,200 foreign Jews were held there. And also, I'm in no way saying that this was not a bloodthirsty regime. Their treatment of Roma people and Slavs was extra brutal. They just didn't round up the Italian Jews. There were even attempts to protect Jews in Italian-occupied areas of Greece, France, and Yugoslavia, which frustrated Hitler. Unfortunately, the Italian army fought like shit and didn't end up occupying too much. But still, I appreciate it. Anyway, in 1943, Italians did what Italians do and called a vote of no confidence against Mussolini, placing him under arrest and ending fascist rule. The Germans went in, seized control of northern and central Italy, freed Mussolini, and installed him as the head of the new Italian Social Republic. This came with a new balance of power. The Italian Social Republic was a puppet state at the mercy of the Germans, and the Germans wanted genocide. The racial laws had required collecting the names and information of Italian Jews, and now the Italians set to work making up for lost time. In 19 months of German occupation, 20% of Italy's pre-war Jewish population was murdered. About 10,000 people. Post-Holocaust, very few Italians were tried for their involvement, probably as part of the whole Nazi, who cares, there's a Cold War to fight thing that the US was doing, and most of the property was not returned. Surprise, surprise, the Pope never said a word. I guess this was a good anti-Semitism. Post-war, Italy never really had to deal with their fascism, and it never really went away. While they do acknowledge the murder of Jews during the Holocaust, there is little acknowledgement of the Roma people who were murdered. All things considered, though, I would like to remind everyone once again that this was still one of the best places to be Jewish in Europe, even in World War II. Jeez, European Jewish history is so depressing. Next episode, we gotta go back to India or Africa. So, ultimately, the Jews of Italy survived, and in the 60s and 70s, many Jews from Italy's colonial territories came over. Not so much from Ethiopia, as they mostly got airlifted to Israel, but Libyan and Tunisian Jews. A decent number of Iranian Jews also came. Today, the Jewish population of Italy is shrinking. In 2007, there were about 45,000 Italian Jews of all persuasions. In 2015, there were 42,850. In 2017, there were 41,200. They make up about 0.5% of Italy's population, with 20K in Rome and 12K in Milan. While there is a reasonable amount of anti-Semitism, a poll from 2008 showed that 23% of Italians believe Jews can never be fully Italian, and 11% believe that Jews lie about the Holocaust. And also, there are a few stabbings, bomb threats, grave desecrations, the usual. But the neo-fascists of Italy spend most of their time beating up immigrants and don't have much time for the Jews. The decline in population is more about limited economic opportunity and declining birth rate. Anyway, I hear the former Roman ghetto is now a lovely gentrified neighborhood with little coffee shops and shit for young professionals. Not many Jews remain, but there is still a synagogue. Nice. Okay, history is history. Move on to religiousity. Religiously, the Italkim are distinct. They are most similar to Romaniot Jews, covered in the previous episode. Even their names are similar. Not Italikim, but the Italian name for them is Ibri Romani, or the Roman Jews, just like the Romaniot. But whereas Romaniot are so named for the Eastern Roman Empire, Ibri Romani are so named for the Western Roman Empire. And actually, the Apulian Jews in the south are Romaniot. Dope. So yeah, religion. Just like in Greece, the majority of Italian Jews are Sephardi, but those of ancient Roman extraction follow the Italian Nusach, which is more closely related to the ancient Palestinian Minhah. So it follows the triennial cycle of Torah reading instead of the annual, and the order of prayers is done differently, I guess. As for those prayers and things, I did see their machzor, but it's in Italian, which I do not speak. I'll link it below, but according to what I can glean from Google Translate, they have a wide array of unique prayers, customs, and philosophies. At least that's what the author said. Okay, moving on. Culture. Culture. We got us a Judeo-Creole here. So there is Judeo-Latin, which is a language that was used in the Middle Ages, and it was vulgar Latin written using Hebrew characters. Some people think this is descended from the true Judeo-Latin spoken in Roman times, but we don't have any preserved evidence. Everything we do have from ancient times is in Judeo-Koine Greek, or regular Latin. However, there is a language that has been spoken for hundreds of years called Judeo-Italian. Same deal as all of them, critically endangered, only 250 speakers remaining. Something super interesting about this language, though, is that when all the city-states of Italy ghettofied their Jews into tiny enclosed areas, the language diverged into a large number of regional dialects called Ghetaiolo. I couldn't find Wikitongues, but the Jewish Language Project says that this is Judeo-Italian theater.
Ma sai, aspetta, non mi dire che si tratta di Anselmo e Peppe.
Aspetta che guardo. Dunque, qui leggo Anselmo Spizzichino e Giuseppe Astrologo. Esattamente, ma li conosci?
Li conosco, mo vedrai che casino che ti fanno quando arrivano.
Ma quando ci sono altre soluzioni, dovranno accontentarsi della matrimoniale.
E meno male che qui i letti sono separati.
Funnest of facts. The first example of the word pizza being used is recorded in a Judeo-Italian glossary in the 1300s, 200 years before non-Jews got to it.
Our fun fact is that the first written example of the word pizza in Italian is from a Judeo-Italian glossary, which contained the entry pizza 200 years before any non-Jewish Italian written evidence of the word.
So there. It's ours. Is pizza Jewish? Yes. Confirmed. Maybe. On the subject of food, there is some alleged heresy. Italian Jews apparently for many years played fast and loose with kashrut. Some ate pork, some didn't eat pork, but ate rabbit, which is also not kosher. Also, while this might be the Sephardi influence, not an ancient practice, they eat rice on Passover, which is weak. Be a man, suffer on Passover. Speaking of Passover, apparently it's a popular tradition to make goose salami. Cool. Besides minor stuff like that, they're pretty Italian culturally, if culturally Italian means anything. Food and waving your hands when you talk, I guess. Is it foo? Nah. Well established historically and genetically. Famous Italian Jews. It's kind of hard to find out if these people are Italkim, so these guys are just listed as Sephardi. The main guy I was hoping for is Enrico Fermi, obviously, my mans. But he wasn't Jewish. His wife was, but he wasn't. So, for science, we have Nobel Prize winner Emilio Sergei, who discovered the antiproton experimentally after it was predicted by Dirac. Also, Rita Levi Montalcini, who did something with neuroscience. There are some other Nobel Prize winners in economics and biology, but I decided to keep it to real sciences. Gotta briefly mention Primo Levi, chemist, writer, Italian resistance partisan, Holocaust survivor. Very, very sad story, but should be read. Then, I was really hoping for something hopeful, like a pop star. So, if you know of one, please let me know. There is Dalida, who was an Egyptian crypto Jew born to Italian parents. Salma Ya Salama is a slap, but I didn't know about her until making this, to be so honest. So, yeah. In closing, I have a little anecdote. I met an Italian Jewish girl once, not Italian American, like a real honest-to-goodness Italian Jewess. Batty, too, if memory serves. I was like, oh, wow, that's so crazy. What's it like being Jewish in Italy? And she was like, whatever. And whatever sounds good to me. Boom. Italian Jews.